Welcome back to the SampanViking on China channel, and today I'm going to be taking more of a look back in Ukraine, but taking more of a look at the possible endgame to the conflict, an endgame that becomes ever more complex as things progress, as the threat of escalation in that complexity gets ever greater. But more specifically, I'm going to look at one very pertinent question, and that is, when will the Russians of the Ukraine rise? Because this is something which I think has been at the heart of the Russian state strategy from the beginning, and an event that so far we have not yet seen, and beyond more than a limited degree. And the question has to be, well, will it? If it doesn't, then you have, I think, the biggest miscalculation in the entire campaign, and one that has very serious ramifications. I have to say, I would be surprised if that is the case. I believe there is a sizable proportion of the Russian-speaking, Russian-identifying population of the Ukraine that are prepared to rise, and it's more a case of, well, why hasn't it happened so far? Well, of course, part of the population did rise. It rose in 2014, and these people are still active as the militias of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and their military are two of the most effective and aggressive, I suppose, militaries in the I call it a special operation, I call it a war, in the war that we are seeing at the moment. But it is, I think, indicative of one of the other questions that has always been, has been a bit of a mystery, which is why the initial Russian force was so small for the level of the task in hand. And it's good to believe, and perhaps not unjustified, that the numbers of around 200,000 are going to be, or at least up to 200,000, may only be 150,000, are sufficient to do the task. But most military analysts have all said, well, you'd have expected, even for this, a far higher number of forces to take part. And I do wonder if the plan has not all along been for the Russian army to provide an umbrella for local forces to uprise and effectively to do all the heavy lifting with support from Russian armour, from Russian artillery, Russian missiles, Russian air force, which in a way, I think, in one way you can say is that they were going to provide the heavy equipment and the local people to provide the infantry. Because one thing I keep hearing is that they just don't have enough infantry. They've got people in vehicles, which is good in certain terrain, but certainly when you're in the north of the country, like around Kiev, all the rest of it, where it's heavily wooded and a little bit more hilly, you need people on the ground. You need foot infantry, like you do in urban warfare. And again, not taking cities was down to a lack of infantry. And I think the idea was that the Russians would go in with their armoured spear points, and then the local people would rise up and they would effectively provide the infantry, the foot infantry, to operate around this armour. Well, this didn't happen, and certainly in the north of the country it caused whatever plan had been intended to be cancelled. Now, I for one have never bought into the capture of Kiev unless it was abandoned and left wide open, in which case obviously they would have taken it. But even with the best numbers, taking a capital, a large capital city, it is no small undertaking. You would want a large professional army made up of the right components, and it wasn't there. Possibly the idea was to surround some of the more friendly smaller cities, and again it let their own people rise up inside and take control and do it that way, which is why they surrounded but didn't go in, and it didn't happen. And the question we have to ask is, well, if that's the case, why did it not happen? And it may very well be that simply the appetite that may once have been held for Russian identity has been lost over the last 8 years as a result of well, goodness knows what. But I have to say, I find that very, very unlikely. Ukraine has not seen stellar economic growth. There isn't comfort there. There has been massive discrimination by the Kiev authorities against and its enforcement arms against Russian speakers, the Russian language. And so I begin to suspect that what we've had over the last, as a result of the last 8 years, is a Russian population that really has been cowed and beaten into submission to the point where the leadership has been taken out, such as it is. And so there's not people are afraid to rise and nobody to coalesce around for those that should wish to do so. Saying that, of course, there have been um, some that have. We've heard them described as saboteurs by the Kiev authorities. Sadly, I suspect a lot of those who effectively did rise, I suppose, really at that time weren't enough and may well have suffered the consequences of doing so. In which case, then that has created another problem, which is that your keenest and leading figures within the local communities have now been eradicated, which means that I suppose, as Russia probably did back in 2014, they'll have to wait a while and then send in special officers to actually play that role, to start the movements, to start the militias, and then to bring up inside local talent that can actually take over in due course. So that is where I think we are with that. It hasn't happened so far, but it is an important component, certainly as we move towards the end game, because as we move towards the end game, that will be Russia taking control of most or all of the majority Russian areas. Some can argue where that is. I mean, certainly we know it's everything from a line from Kharkiv to Odessa and below. Would it extend to all the territories east of the Dnieper River up towards Sumy and around there? Well, who knows? It isn't majority Russian territory up there, which is probably why the propagandists from Kiev have had such a field day since the northern operation decided to withdraw. But again, I think there could be enough there, certainly east of the Dnieper, maybe to make it a viable operation. But irrespective, even if they don't initially go that far and they simply stay with the major Russian majority areas, once they have those, that then becomes a game changer when it's under Russian control, because then you will see the numbers, as we've seen in Luhansk, as we've seen in Donetsk. And then I think we start to see the numbers start to join up into militias, and those militias being employed in a very, very effective way. And that very effective way is, of course, to look to subdue the rest of the country. I don't think Russia has any intention of sending its forces into the rest of the country, but I think it's perfectly happy to see local Ukrainian Russians take down that role and maybe with some support take on the occupation, the conquest and occupation of what is left of West Ukraine in order to bring it all to book. So definitely, yeah, a Ukraine of parts, which is going to be left. The very pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, Russian identifying areas of the south and east. A second swathe where it's more marginal around the north and the centre of the country, and then finally, of course, in the least Russian areas in the west. So I could see up to 2/3 to 3/4 of Ukraine being occupied one way or another, and that still is on the books. People say, well, how can you say that, Sampan? The campaign so far was supposed to be lightning. It hasn't happened. The fighting that's going on, the northern campaign was abandoned. The fighting is taking place in the Donbass. It's very, very slow. Progress is being made, but it's very, very slow. And here you are saying, well, we'll take these parts and then raise an army and take the rest. Well, it doesn't have to happen in 5 minutes. I think once the Russians realized this wasn't going to be a lightning campaign, they reverted away from quick strikes as they thought of the war they were going to be fighting and started to adapt to fight the war that they suddenly realized they had been presented with and had to fight. And this will mean taking control back of these Russian-speaking areas and rapidly bringing, and I'm sure there is a lot of discontent, when you see people being interviewed in the areas that have been liberated, certainly in Donetsk, certainly in Mariupol, you find that there really is very, very little love towards the regime in Kiev. And I'm sure they are ready to rise, and simply they just need the conditions to feel confident that they're going to actually achieve something. I won't say they're cowards. I mean, that would be unfair, and quite callous. I think if I was in that position, even if I wanted to rise, I would want to know it would achieve something, that it had a structure, it had support, it had guidance, and I wouldn't simply go onto the street and in 5 minutes later be lying in a pool of my own blood. Pointless and achieves nothing. You want to achieve something. And this, I think, is what I believe that the Russians of the Ukraine are waiting for. So as more territory outside of the already established Luhansk and Donetsk territories are created, as we've seen in the south of the country, as we seem to be seeing with Kherson, as it extends up to Kharkiv, and all the rest, then I think you will start to see the large numbers starting to come together, and that will be the impetus to start moving into the less pro-Russian areas. And even there will be those who will be pro-Russian, who will then, come out of their bunkers and start to get involved. And so the tables, which have been a violent, slight majority of non-Russian Ukrainians exercising brutal authority over their less than willing pro-Russian compatriots, that those tables will be turned, and it will be Russians then exercising control over large amounts, even if not the entire country that is currently defined by the borders of Ukraine. Well, I think that's going to be it for today. I hope you have enjoyed, if enjoyment is the right word. If you have, please like. It is important to give the algorithm notice that this channel is getting some attention. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It's free, and likewise, this also helps the channel to grow. If you would like others to hear what I have to say, please share. And if you have anything to say or any questions on this subject or the channel in general, please leave a comment and I will respond just as quickly as it is possible and appropriate for me to do so. Thank you very much. See you in the next video.